Tony, I'd like to welcome you to the program. Thanks for your patience. Hope you're doing well, Tony. Now, Tony, it's funny. Europeans are saying exactly. I was going to echo what Jerome just said. We're not part of this yet. You're imposing pretty strict sanctions there. You're providing arms to Kiev. You are also in the process of freezing a lot of Russian elites' bank accounts and possibly repossessing. I should say repossessing, but I should say confiscating a lot of their property, including luxury ships and whatnot. So how are you not a part of this?
Well, Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, is feeling a lot more confident now because what he's saying is not being countered by the Russian media. It's been shut down completely here, and so he can be a bit more confident about the lies he tells, knowing that no one will dare speak against him. Now, this is quite a frightening sort of a person to have around, isn't it? And if you look at what he said, I mean, he's saying we're not part of this conflict. Of course they are. They are actually behind the conflict. The NATO countries have been, including the European Union countries, pouring weapons into Ukraine, which has caused this in the first place. There was an attempt to get a new security arrangement going around Christmas time 2021 and in the early part of January. Instead, NATO made sure that that was never going to happen by actually bringing in hundreds and hundreds of these anti-tank missiles designed to provoke Russia. And also, as some of your viewers may not realise, the Bulgarian Air Force has been told they've got to bring old Soviet-era fighter jets, they've only got a handful of them, over to Poland. So he is actually preparing, it seems, to use old Soviet-era equipment from Eastern Europe to provoke, in other words, to get those pilots from Bulgaria to fly into Ukraine potentially and maybe get shot down to provoke an incident. So what Stoltenberg is saying is simply a lie, that they're not involved in this. They very much are involved in this. And of course it's not a defensive alliance, NATO. What they've been doing is very offensive in terms of military might, moving that eastwards, and also, of course, all the threatening behaviour ever since the invasion by Russia of Ukraine last week. So yeah, this is, I'm afraid, the problem when we see censorship. And by the way, you can still get RT. I mean, the kids know how to get it over here. They'll be still watching it, but you can't. The older people will find it a bit more difficult to navigate how to find RT. And this is a major part of what NATO has been making sure happens, is that the big private corporations that control the telecommunications around the world are all doing their best to switch off the Russian point of view. So when the people like Stoltenberg lie, there's nobody to counter the lie and to show people. For example, the evidence now that there's a lot of Ukrainian men have been told they're not allowed to leave the country, they must join up and fight. Many of those people are not interested in fighting the Russians and dying. They much rather allow Russia to carry on. I mean, for example, this incident today with the nuclear power station, we've really very little idea what really happened, because what we're getting is a propaganda line through NATO and through the military and through the British press. And I would remind people that don't realise there are many military reservists, as I was hearing tonight from an expert on my programme, sitting right now as news producers and people who are actually providing news to the British people. They think they're getting journalists doing this job, but many of those people are actually military reservists. So their loyalty is really to what they're being told to do by the military rather than simply to tell the truth and give balanced journalism. So we're seeing a militarisation of what you might call the nervous system of humanity. That is what the broadcasting networks are slowly being militarised, and it's happened at a very, very fast rate this week, particularly with the shutdown of the information coming over from Russia. But as I say, young people will be getting this information. They know, and many people realise that they can spot this censorship a mile off, and they know, they smell a rat. They smell a rat amongst their own broadcasters and their own fellow countrymen who are now trying to pull the wool over their eyes.
Thank you, gentlemen. If you could both just hold on for a second, I'm going to read some social media reactions to the story off of Twitter. All right, Matthew Bastable says, so all these NATO countries which are sending weapons and vehicles to help Ukraine and allowing their civilians to go fight for Ukraine and imposing sanctions do not all class as helping fight, maybe means do not all classify as helping fight Russia. Like it or not, NATO is already at war. They're just using Ukraine to fight it. And then we have a Rowdy James Yancey saying, I do not want billions of American dollars being given away to Ukraine for cybersecurity and more weapons. It is wrong. Give that cash to Americans. There are people living in tents in downtown Los Angeles and people eating out of trash cans in New York City. All right, Kazak says Putin wants to return to the days of the Tsar and be the first since Nicholas II was removed in March or 1917. Now that I write that the timing for his invasion of Ukraine seems ironic, the world must unite in stopping Putin and aiding both Ukraine and Russian people. And then Alexander Hrebet says Russia bans YouTube in another attempt to kill the truth. The Kremlin knows that people are angry of the war against Ukraine. Putin is desperate. I feel the falling of the Kremlin walls in the air here in Kiev. Such a fresh smell. Jerome, I'm going to come back to you. Energy is a big deal. The U.S. tried to make some guarantees to try to get the Europeans on board. Like I mentioned earlier, Berlin initially didn't want it. It wanted the Nord Stream 2 pipeline completely exempted, no matter how crippling sanctions got. He felt, I mean, even the U.S. gets a lot of oil from Russia. They shut down that whole Keystone pipeline and whatnot that would have brought in nearly 1 million barrels a day when they're getting about half that much from Russia. That got shut down, so they're basically in a quagmire. They could tap into reserves, but not indefinitely. So basically, there's a big issue here when it comes to energy. How are the Europeans planning to navigate through this thing if this becomes a protracted war?
Well, the thing about it is, Daniel, it doesn't matter which energy expert you speak to or which economist you speak to, they will say the same, that you cannot navigate through it. Because if you decide to have a sort of an energy war with Russia, you're in big trouble if you're in the European Union in particular. Because the 27 nations of the EU overall, I mean, we're talking generally, some nations take more oil and gas than others. But the point is, you know, we get 40% of our gas from Russia, 27% of our oil. And the thing about it is, it's cheap gas. It's actually cheap gas. The contracts that they have with Russia they're very favourable economically. Now, when you switch that off, or when you disrupt that, and when you're starting to import, you know, liquefied natural gas from the likes of Egypt, you know, or they're talking about many different countries in terms of where they're going to bring this fuel from. It just pushes up the prices. So actually, you know, at this point when they're talking about it already, the markets get rumbled, and you see, you know, we're seeing oil prices going up and energy prices in general going up, because a lot of our electricity is generated through gas as well. So, but the real punch will come down the line in a couple of months. So if we do see major disruptions, it will, the economic impact, you know, because it passes on. It's not just people in their own private dwellings or businesses even trying to keep things going in terms of their energy needs. It actually has a knock-on impact to all elements of the economy. So it could be really catastrophic economically. I mean, it might make the 2008 economic crash look like a joke if we have a major disruption in terms of energy, because importing from far and away places, it just doesn't do it. It just doesn't cut the ice in terms of meeting the needs in a way that's economical.
All right, thank you, Jerome. And Tony, wholesale gas prices in Europe on Friday rose above $2,000 per 1,000 cubic meters for a second straight day, And meanwhile, Europe's London Brent North Sea crude climbed to over $115 a barrel. Tony, we're only 9 days into this thing. Final thoughts with you there, bud.
I think it's pretty clear that the Western economies are not democracies. Although there is this, what Putin calls this, a kind of a drama of democracy. And so we see this kind of thing roll out on TV where you have so-called opposition. The fact is that many of the Western leaders are contemptuous about their own people. So the idea that people are going to have to pay more for their basic foodstuffs, their energy, that there's going to be runaway inflation, because that's what energy increases mean. It means that everything starts going up in price. Everybody that's manufacturing or even doing a service industry or distribution industry has to put up their prices. And so you start to get potentially runaway inflation. And this is designed, I think, to set the domestic populations in the West on the back foot so that they are impoverished even more. And the other incredible thing about this Ukraine situation is that it's basically a war by remote control. It's 5,000 miles away in Washington where the shots are being called. And those people who are at risk in this war, those people who are actually on the ground in Ukraine, people who are facing the Russian army, etc., and of course those in neighbouring countries, are very much more in the front line and in the firing line. And I am absolutely appalled and disgusted by the failure of the European politicians, so-called democratic politicians, to stand up to the Americans and tell them, no, we're not going to have a war in Eastern Europe for the benefit of the US control of Europe. We need to have some people with a little bit of spine to stand up to the United States, 5,000 miles away, trying to call the shots in Eastern Europe.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're out of time. I want to thank you both. It's always a pleasure checking with both of you. Actually, Jerome Hughes out of Brussels and Mr. Tony Gosling, they're joining us from Bristol.